welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of all the big developments in the world of North Carolina politics and public policy. These are the stories we've been covering each week. We like to wrap them all up here for you here at the end of the week. Joining us on the couches this week for some expert insights and analysis. First, we have Mitch Kokai, Senior Policy Analyst for the John Locke Foundation, and political reporter Teresa Opeka. Glad you're both here. And then, of course, David Larson, Carolina Journal's opinion editor, and education reporter David Bass. All right, I look forward to this every week. Thanks for joining us. So this week, the General Assembly is back in session. They took a little spring break last week, back in session, in force. There are some big stories that have been really circulating around the state government complex, but one of the biggest ones has been fairness in women's sports. So this week, Kentucky swimmer Riley Gaines was on hand. She was walking around the state legislative complex in Raleigh. She made news after tying a transgender biological male swimmer and being denied the trophy at the NCAA by the NCAA. She's been speaking to legislatures across the country, and here is what she told North Carolina's state lawmakers.
That next day, I raced Thomas in the 200 freestyle, which ended up in a tie. We went the exact same time down to the 100th of a second. Having only one trophy, the NCAA gave it to Thomas and told me that I had to go home empty-handed because Thomas needed to hold the trophy for pictures. I felt betrayed and belittled, and like my efforts and sacrifices I had made had been reduced to a photo op to validate the identity and feelings of a male. But my feelings did not matter. But that is not all. In addition to being forced to give up our awards and our titles and our opportunities, the NCAA forced female swimmers to share a locker room with Thomas, a 6'4", 22-year-old male equipped with and exposing male genitalia in a room full of vulnerable, undressed women. Let me be clear. We were not forewarned about this arrangement. No one asked for our consent, and we did not give our consent. If nothing else, I truly hope you can see how this is a violation of our right to privacy and how we felt embarrassed, uncomfortable, and even traumatized by this experience. In 1972, Congress enacted Title IX to end unjust sex discrimination in all aspects of education, including collegiate athletics. That next day, I raced Thomas in the 200 freestyle, which ended up in a tie. We went the exact same time down to the 100th of a second. Having only one trophy, the NCAA gave it to Thomas and told me that I had to go home empty-handed because Thomas needed to hold the trophy for pictures.
Okay, so that emotional testimony really moved a lot of folks that were there in the room, and I was fortunate enough that she made a little time and sat down with me and kind of told me her backstory and what this experience was like and what she's been going through for the last year. Gaines said that she was supposed to go to dental school this year, instead has partnered with the Independent Women's Forum, has been traveling around the country. As a result of her testimony and lots of work by several state lawmakers, the Fairness in Women's Sports Bill passed the House on Wednesday, just flew right through committees where she testified, and then now the Senate is taking it up. David Larson, I really think that this has been something that we've talked about a lot, but now we're seeing it run through the legislature. You've got daughters, your dad. I've got athletes. Tell me what your thoughts are about this.
Yeah, I think it's an important bill. Just there's been cultural changes that maybe people didn't see that they would be coming. So a lot of people say these legislatures are just pulling this bill that's not needed. It's, why are you just randomly coming up with this? But it is sort of a cultural moment where there are more people like Leah Thomas, who was a male swimmer ranked in the 400s and then comes in and starts winning records and medals. And so it is something that really, I think, needs to be addressed because it's a new thing culturally. And, as a dad with a daughter, what she described there in the locker room, that would make me uncomfortable as well.
Yeah, so. Sure. David Bass, tell me what you think about it. You're a dad too. I mean, if it had been my daughter, regardless of whether she was a 16-year-old swimmer or a 6-year-old swimmer, it's alarming. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I think I knew her story. The part about the locker room was new information, and just how alarming that would be, I'm sure, for all those girls, and especially to have no warning about it, to have no sense of being aware of what they were going into with that. And I think this is one of those cases where it's kind of like a lot of people are saying, the sky is purple on this sort of thing, when you're like, no, the sky is blue. And it's a common sense thing. And that it's this controversial, I think, says a lot about where we are right now.
Absolutely. Mitch, so this bill, though, doesn't say transgender athletes can't compete, correct? It just says they can't compete in sports that are designated for women, for biological women.
That's the idea, is you keep out the transgender females who are biological males from competing against women and girls. And in fact, the original version on the Senate side had to be tweaked because it would have stopped girls from competing in men's sports, like when you have a girl who's the kicker on a football team or the girl who's a wrestler, and they decided, well, no, we don't want to stop that, because in these cases, the girls know what they're getting into. They're competing with boys. What you want to stop is the biological male who is now identifying as a female from competing against girls. I think one of the other things that we haven't talked about yet is Riley Gaines attracted the attention because she has had a national following on this issue. Sure. But also alongside her was the athlete in North Carolina who was injured because a transgender bunked her in the head with a volleyball and has continuing problems. And so it's not just a brought out of the blue issue. This is something that can be a real problem.
Sure. One of the bill sponsors, Carl Gillespie from Cherokee County, he represents the district. Peyton McNabb is the one that you were just referencing. I had a chance to sit down and talk to her as well. She said she has continuing injuries, that she didn't feel like that her injuries were acknowledged. And she basically, her season was over, her volleyball career is over. She's got ongoing learning issues and neck pain and concussion symptoms from that concussion. But it was interesting. In that room, I went to the hearing, the opponents of this bill said, well, we're sorry that somebody got hurt, but people are going to get hurt anyway. Tell me what your thoughts are. Is that the argument that you're hearing against something like this?
I think the main argument is that, hey, this is anti-transgender, it's anti-LGBTQ, it's just mean, homophobic Republican lawmakers, and it's just the latest example of this. I think the main argument that we're going to hear moving forward, and you sort of saw this coming out, was it's going to be the next HB2, and businesses are going to flee, and sports competitions are not going to want to come to North Carolina. So don't pass it, Republicans, because you're going to pay the price if you do.
Like a threat.
Basically, they're saying, hey, we've already lived through HB2 once. You're going to get it again if you pass a bill like this, and some of the other things they're talking about, like making drag shows adults only, and other things that the LGBTQ community has seen as anti-them.
Sure. But North Carolina is not really on an island in this. 20 other states have passed women and fairness in women's sports bills, but maybe at the national level?
Right. So North Carolina's own Virginia Fox is actually a proponent of the national bill. And as you mentioned, Riley Gaines is going to be in D.C. today, speaking to what she did in North Carolina yesterday, and also speaking to Virginia Fox as well. So yeah, it's a national issue. I believe the proponent of the first bill was there yesterday from Idaho. She testified. So yeah, it is a national issue. And as Mitch said, I don't think people are going to stop moving to North Carolina. There's so many businesses and people moving here, and it's a great state to live in. I don't think that that's going to really hurt things at this level. But yes, it is a national level, and I think more states are going to be signing on to this as well.
Very interesting. So you mentioned the HB2, David. You and I have talked about this a little bit. The difference between the environment that we're seeing under this bill and the environment we saw under HB2, similar characters on both sides of this. And we heard Senator Jay Chaudhuri, thank you. I apologize. I knew I was going to garble that one. Talk about HB2. Here's what.
If you or any of the other sponsors or co-sponsors of the bill heard from the business community about whether this bill would harm our state's efforts to recruit and retain companies here in the state.
Senator Sawyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the political play you're having here.
It's not political.
Senator Sawyer's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm here to protect young women, and that's what I'm here for. Thank you so much for the question.
So then you heard Senator Vicki Sawyer from Iredell County kind of almost chuckle. I mean, this is a different environment now, right? Is it your outrageous story?
Yes, so that was going to be my outrageous story for the week, is just seeing how different the climate is on this topic from during HB2, which, there was the belief back then, Indiana touched on a bill that, referenced transgenderism, and then we did as well, and there were just huge boycotts, and there was national stories over and over again. But you saw that chuckle from Senator Sawyer, to me, signifies just how different of an environment we are in now. For whatever reason, states have not been intimidated, and there's 20 of them that have passed these kind of bills, and there's around 20 that also have bills for banning the transition of minors with chemicals and surgeries before you're 18, and Human Rights Campaign that sort of organized a lot of that HB2 boycott. They're just as upset about all of those bills happening, but it seems like there's just too many of them. So, it seems like there's not the leverage they used to have. They had leverage over these companies, but a lot of these companies are actually leaving the states that have more favorable laws in those areas and going to these red states. So Texas, Florida, and North Carolina are actually three of the 3 states people are moving to the most. And Texas and Florida, as well as Tennessee and other states, are passing these bills. Just this month, Wyoming and Kansas are added to that. And we might be, but those are the biggest, most growing states. And so businesses seem to have lost their leverage on this topic. So it'll be interesting to see. One thing of note, I was just reviewing during HB2, those boycotts were largely driven, or in part, by North Carolina progressives. So I was just looking back on that, the NBA pulled out of Charlotte, and the mayor had this big press statement. Thank you so much for pulling out of Charlotte.
Jennifer Roberts.
Jennifer
she
Roberts.
was the mayor at the time.
And Governor Cooper, had traveled to Silicon Valley and talked to a bunch of them about the negativity about these bills, and then soon after they pulled out, Equality NC and NAACP of North Carolina both were openly advocating for people not to come here. And then, you saw Chaudhry saying, well, are you guys worried that, maybe companies are going to pull out? It's sort of a show of the hand a little bit, like we might be thinking about leading boycotts again if you,
like a threat.
Yeah, sort of a threat, that. So, but it doesn't seem like that companies are. That leverage is gone. You see it in Florida with Disney or with the Bud Light thing. They're almost more afraid of upsetting Republicans sometimes now. Bud Light had a big apology for having a transgender advocate, on as one of their spokespeople. So definitely, just the climate has seemed to have shifted a lot. Yeah.
It definitely seems to be a different world. Now, speaking of a different world, Representative Tricia Cotham, a newly minted Republican, has filed a bill that would dramatically expand, actually, school choice in North Carolina. I think, David Bash, you've been covering this. Is this her first bill as a Republican? I'm not sure, but it really would do big things.
If it's not her first as a primary sponsor, it's one of her first. So in the House now, there was already a bill introduced in the Senate that would do the same thing. And the fact that the identical bill in the House, Cotham signed on to it as that 72nd vote in the House to overturn a gubernatorial veto, I think that speaks volumes about where school choice is going in the state. I think it's interesting, too, that Speaker Moore signed on as a primary sponsor to the House version, which just tells you there's even more support behind this idea. And just to reiterate what the bill would do is basically take the Opportunity Scholarship Program that right now is only available to families at a certain income level and make it universal. So it would be available regardless of income in a tiered system where lower income people would have first access, and then it would work throughout the funds and until it would be available for higher wealth families. So the whole idea is behind it. I think a lot of other states are also beginning to do this on school choice, is making it universally available, not as targeted as it has been.
So we've seen several bills come out that would, the budget putting more money into it, and ESAs, a few other things. Are you sensing a momentum in school choice?
I think the COVID pandemic was a huge turning point. I think there was momentum before then, but I think that just showed so many parents the holes in the education system and just the desire for flexibility. One thing works well for one family, something else works well for another. But there's national momentum, there's huge momentum in North Carolina, and Cotham has come out leading on this issue on school choice. I mean, if you look at her Twitter, it's full of
Yeah,
pro
and
school
then actually,
choice
she's our
things.
tweet of the week this week. You see it right there. Children first. That right? That at the end of the day, that's what it's about.
Absolutely, yeah. And she's even so she had tweeted out some content in support of the idea of a universal ESA as well, which is another step even beyond opportunity scholarships, where you'd have these funds available for parents to use for homeschooling, for tuition, for all kinds of things.
Now, Mitch, this school choice has been a big issue for the John Locke Foundation for a really long time. Is this more movement than you've seen over the years?
It's certainly a continuation of movement. I think the first big thing we saw was after the Republicans took control of the General Assembly now more than a decade ago. First thing they did was get rid of the cap on charter schools, which had been holding back school choice. But then they started the opportunity scholarships. And at some point, and this actually took place before the pandemic, they decided we're going to build in additional funding for opportunity scholarships 10 years out. Now, of course, they can't bind future General Assemblies who could say, well, no, we're not going to do that. But certainly it paved the way because it set in law that the baseline is more funding for these opportunity scholarships moving forward. So that's been a good development. Another very interesting piece of this puzzle was something that happened on the legal front, and that is as this bill was being filed and there was publicity about it, we also learned that a lawsuit led by Tamika Walker Kelly, head of the North Carolina Association of Educators, which is the state affiliate of the large National Education Association Teachers Union, she dropped her lawsuit against the opportunity scholarships. There have been a couple of lawsuits against opportunity scholarships. One was filed before the program even started, saying it was unconstitutional. The state Supreme Court disagreed and said, no, this is fine. So the lawsuit that Tamika Walker Kelly and her supporters filed didn't attack the basic constitutionality of opportunity scholarships. Instead, they said that they were challenging the program as it was administered. So it was technically called an as-applied constitutional challenge. But as this case went through the court system, the State Court of Appeals looked at this and said, you know, we think that this is not something that is an as-applied challenge, because if you win, you're going to get rid of this whole program. This is a basic constitutional challenge on the face of the law. And after it was sent to a 3-judge panel, I think Tamika Walker Kelly looked at where things stood with the legal landscape in North Carolina and said, it's probably time to get rid of this suit.
Very interesting. Now, you've been covering the executive branch for us. The DPI superintendent, Catherine Truitt, she's seems to be not opposed to school choice. She's a school choice supporter, runs the school system. How do you think she's going to view some of these things that we're seeing as it expands? They're trying to make some changes there.
Yeah, they are. But I think she's more of a moderate. I think she would be agreeable to some of them.
Sure.
So it's hard to say.
Right.
We don't all have a crystal ball, but I think she's pretty moderate on that
Yeah.
subject.
I think so too. Now, kids, you have children at home, and school choice has got to be important. I feel like some of the younger generation, y'all are younger than me, they're consumers and they want lots of choice and lots of flexibility, and they're used to having everything at their iPhone and stuff shipped in 2 days. So the idea of a government-run school, you go to the school that matches your address, it's not sitting well with millennials wherever they are on the political spectrum.
Yeah, I agree. It's something that I talked about last episode a little bit, in that I'll be excited to have more choices available, especially the Universal ESA. If I could just have some money and decide how to just kind of create my own custom program, even for my kids, that would homeschool co-op or a private school. Those kind of things are exciting. Kind of like you're saying, goes into all the angle that we have as Americans too, of just being kind of a consumer culture where things are customized to us and we like that. And if somebody tries to shoehorn everything into a one-size-fits-all, we rebel against that a little bit. I was a little interested in this bill, got a little bit of pushback from the right, which I didn't expect so much. To that tweet, James Lindsay, who's a national figure, responded, and he says that school choice, you got to be careful. It's something that would get strings attached. If you're receiving money from the government for your private school, eventually the government might be able to have a bunch of strings with that, where you need to teach this, maybe more left-wing perspective. And we had somebody submit an op-ed Robert Bortons, who's a homeschool,
Right.
very important person in that movement. He runs Classical Conversations. So that's something I hadn't really considered a lot. Is that
I don't know if that's where we are in North Carolina.
No,
right? I mean,
I think
don't
we're
know if
far
it's-
from that.
Yeah, I think so. I think it would be, in an ideal world, maybe that's the case. But I just don't think we're going to be to a point where even if it was a voucher system or ESAs, that kind of thing, we still have to work within the system somewhat that we have.
And David Bass and I were talking about that a little bit. If the left, had the power to do what they wanted, they wouldn't keep school choice and ESAs, but then add strings. They'd probably just get rid of it. So I think
Right.
to me, that's not necessarily a fair critique or a valid one, but
Sure.
there are people that
It is interesting.
have
Lots
that,
of,
yeah,
it's
perspectives on it.
It's a consumer culture for school choice.
One interesting thing with this too is just the political reality going
Right.
forward. I think as more and more families experience school choice, you're going to have a situation politically where it becomes less and less feasible to actually oppose it.
Right.
I mean, I think in North Carolina, we're at 20% or more of students now are in some sort of school
Really?
of choice, a charter school,
20% or
homeschool,
more. Wow.
a private school. So that becomes more and more difficult for Democrats to really come out strongly in opposition to saying, let's get rid of opportunity scholarships. All of a sudden, you have all these families on it who say, wait a minute, this is going away.
Sure.
It becomes more difficult politically.
Very
So-
interesting. So you got to be a little suspicious of the government. Of course, I want to squeeze this in. Of course, so an audit from the North Carolina State Auditor's Office, Beth Wood, found that the state's Pandemic Recovery Office did not do a really good job of tracking all that federal money. You remember all those taxpayer dollars that were flying everywhere there during the pandemic. Now they're going back and looking. Say, did they keep good records of where the money went, how it was spent? Turns out, maybe not. You've been covering this story.
Right. And it's part of a statewide single audit that's done every year. And as you mentioned, the Pandemic Recovery Office, there's other offices too. But per Pandemic Recovery Office, they didn't properly track $160 million.
Wow.
Yeah, of funding for COVID relief funds. And other departments, mentioned about DPI before, they didn't do some specific site visits.
Okay.
Didn't keep track of the money that way. Also, Department of Health and Human Services. What they had was they were supposed to be responding to, I believe it was 60% of people who asked for emergency grants had to wait between 30 and 160 days, where the federal requirements is at least 30 days.
Wow.
So overall, there were mistakes made with the federal funding, COVID relief funds, and it wasn't properly monitored. Basically, and also too, for the Pandemic Recovery Office and also DHHS, this is 2 years in a row where they made the same mistakes. A lot of the offices, their answer was, we didn't have the staffing. There's staffing shortages. DHHS blamed county social services for their part in it too. So basically, they were blaming staffing shortages and also, just the way things were going. But Beth Wood's office said that's okay, but you have to have a contingency plan in place, because a lot of these funds could actually be sent back to the federal government. You don't want to do that, and a lot of people are hurting. They're not getting the funding that they should be, eligible for.
Sure. So, Mitch, tell me what your thoughts are. This was a ton of money that was going around, and you and I talked about this when all this happened. Who's getting this? How do we know where it's going? We're racking up some serious debt. What are your thoughts about this, and whether we'll really ever be able to recover and figure out what happened?
Well, there have to be safeguards
Sure.
with any program like this, and I think the point of the audit that Beth Wood's office put out is that there just aren't enough safeguards. There need to be more. The problem with her reporting on this is what's going to happen after she puts out the report. Everyone will say, yes, okay, we agree, and then nothing will happen.
Right.
There is no accountability. No one's going to go to jail over this.
Right.
No one's going to have to fork out money from their own pocketbook to repay anything. It's basically just people saying, well, we hear you, Auditor, and we'll do better next time. But then they don't really have any incentive to do that. The only way they ever will is if the General Assembly comes back and says, if you didn't spend this money correctly, you don't get this money anymore.
Right.
And until that happens, it's basically going to be the case of Beth Wood sounding the alarm in the darkness.
Sure.
And people occasionally say, oh yeah, we'll do something about it, and then not.
And then
Like
not.
a slap on the wrist.
Exactly. But this money's this is a big part of inflation, right? I mean, we're feeling it. It shouldn't be a slap on the wrist.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because, you know, with the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of people who were told, you know, you can't go to work, or, you know, you can't, money that they were used to having wasn't there. So at that level, it makes sense that the government would be sending out all of this cash. But then it seems, you know, whenever that happens, somebody figures out a way to have fraud or, you know, misuse funds, or so, you know, it's something that happens with big pools of cash.
Yeah, of course.
Usually it's hard to keep everybody accountable and make sure it gets where it's supposed to go. And then in this case, you know, with the amount that has been spent, I think it has been the main driver of inflation, you know, just all this extra money floating around that a lot of it needed to get to people, and then it's just who knows where it went. But that's, you know, we had 7% inflation year over year last year. So that's, you know, made our food more expensive, gas, all these things. So.
All right, so one more thing I want to squeeze in before we head out here. More COVID fallout. Where did the money go? All of these questions. There's some UNC System kids that want their money back.
That's right. This is a lawsuit that was filed based on the first semester that things closed down during COVID. We all remember almost everything shut down in March of 2020. And there was a lawsuit filed by several students and a parent that said, look, you shut down the campus. Yeah. We weren't living in our dorms anymore. We weren't eating the meal plans. We didn't have access to computer labs. We should get a partial refund.
Sure.
So they sued about this. This case got to the State Court of Appeals, and at that level, the Court of Appeals ruled unanimously in favor of the university system and against the students, saying the General Assembly passed a law in 2020 that basically protected the university from a lawsuit like this, saying that they needed to refund money. But now these same students are appealing to the North Carolina Supreme Court, hoping the Supreme Court will take up that case, saying, look, they could pass that law, but it's unconstitutional if they broke a contract. And their contract was, we get to live on campus, we get the access to these meal plans and intramural facilities and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And, yes, and if it didn't happen, we should get some of that money back. So the state Supreme Court has not yet decided whether to take that case. There is another separate case that also went through the Court of Appeals, and that was not for that first semester, but the next semester, the fall of 2020, after we were already into COVID, UNC Chapel Hill and NC State were still shut down. Right. And some students there are saying, why are we paying for things that we couldn't use in that semester? And so they're asking for refunds there. That case is allowed to move forward, but the university has appealed to the Supreme Court saying, shut this down. This could open us up to millions of dollars of refunds if you allow that to go forward. So those two cases could have a major impact both on the bottom line and on the pocketbooks of these students.
Sure, and my personal pocketbook.
That's
I had
right.
two
The
kids in
parents
college.
too. The parents
Yeah, I had
too.
2 kids in college that spring of 2020. We'll be watching those really closely. Thanks so much. Now, those are just some of the stories that we've been covering here at Carolina Journal. I hope you'll go check them out at carolinajournal.com and like and follow to get the debrief here every week. Thanks for joining us.